Good evening, Lake Orion. Welcome to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina, and the co-host of Between Taorminas, which is also on ONTV. I want to talk to you guys today about the Monroe Doctrine, which is currently still in place as we speak. It is one of the oldest living documents outside of the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. Declaration of Independence. The Monroe Doctrine took place on December 2nd, 1823, back when James Monroe was the president, and John Quincy Adams at that time was the vice president, but he was also the guy that was pretty much in charge of the document. Basically, the doctrine declared that the United States did not want Europe to interfere in the Western Hemisphere. And more often than not, the United States was often seen as the, quote, major power in the Western Hemisphere. This reflects because this was the United States policy at the time and even still in present in the Western Hemisphere. Now, it's very important to understand what was going on in the 1820s. But you even have to go further, back into the Colonial Era. Back in before the pre-American Revolution, at that time, we had basically three countries in Europe that was controlling the continental United States. You had Britain, France, and Spain. Spain at that time controlled the areas that we know today as California, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas, all of Mexico, and the majority of Latin America, minus Brazil, which was controlled by Portugal. The Great Britain controlled the eastern seaboard from today's day of Maine all the way down to Georgia. Now, Spain also had Florida as well, so that was technically part of Spain as well. Now, France controlled Canada, and they also controlled the Mississippi Valley, and they also had territory in the Great Lakes. Numerous wars were fought, particularly between Britain and France, over control of North America, which resulted in the French and Indian War, which was a smaller version of the 7 Years' War, which was taking place in Europe and throughout the world. And at the end of the day, France ended up losing all their territory in North America. Britain would control Florida from Spain, who actually sided with France, and then came the American Revolution, where the United States took over the eastern parts of the eastern seaboard, the eastern parts, which was formerly held by Britain. Britain, however, at that time controlled Canada, which they had won from the French. They won the Quebec area. They had control of Canada as well, and they ended up making it a dominion. And then Spain also regained Florida back from the British. Now, in 1803, we would have the Louisiana Purchase, where France ended up getting Louisiana back, which was basically French territory before France gave that land to Spain, and Spain would end up controlling Louisiana, which included the port of New Orleans, and they ended up giving it back in a secret treaty of San Afriano in 1800 to France. And so France had control of that, and then the United States did business with Napoleon, and Napoleon agreed to sell the entire Louisiana territory when Jefferson originally wanted just New Orleans for $10 million. Napoleon agreed to sell the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million, and that was a big territorial gain for the United States. Now, during that time in the 1820s, the Latin America was in revolt. At that point, directly directed against Spain and against Portugal. Brazil had declared their independence from Portugal. Spain was fighting multiple wars with the Latin American nations, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina. Now, Spain had support. Spain had support from the alliance, the Holy Alliance, which was Austria, Prussia, Russia, and even France, which was formed during the Napoleonic Wars and promoted monarchism, in which the monarchies were in control, and they decided they were going to aid Spain, who at this point was, again, a monarchy, in reconquering their Latin American territories. At that time, the United States had no navy, and there was a lot of, quote, bluff. Austria particularly considered what the United States was declaring a bluff because they did not have no navy, and their armies were not strong enough to go against the entire alliance of Austria, Prussia, Russia, France, and Spain. Now, at this point, we're looking at the United States had just took Florida, was in the process of either taking over or was fighting over Florida with Spain. They were looking to hopefully intervene in what was going on with Latin America. And that's what caused the declaration. Now, one big key who understood the Monroe Doctrine was Great Britain. The United States and Great Britain had fought in the War of 1812. Britain also had control of Canada. The United States attempted to invade Canada, but Great Britain, along with their Canadian and indigenous allies, held on to Canada, and as a result, Canada stayed in British hands. So Britain understood, and they did not have the appetite to fight. So Britain decided to accept and understand the Monroe Doctrine. So as a result, the British Navy kind of became that barrier preventing the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians from aiding the Spanish and letting these Latin American countries, particularly Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, and Argentina, declare their independence from Spain. Now, the reaction from the Latin American countries was that of, okay, we like this. Simon Bolivar, who, if you remember from Venezuela history, approved of this, as did Anthony Taormina, who was the Colombian person who declared independence, as well as Manuel Baraglo of Argentina. Now, during 1818 to 1823, multiple countries declared their independence from Spain and became independent countries. Now, Britain still held territory at this time. Britain had control of the British Guianas, which is located on the northern tip of South America. Spain still had control of Cuba. Spain and France at that time, Spain still had control and France had territory over the Caribbean. Haiti had just declared their independence from 1803 against France. The Dominican Republic was still controlled by Spain. So it wasn't entirely all of the Caribbean and the Latin American areas that had independence. Just the four major countries, Mexico, Venezuela, Colombia, Argentina, and then other ones like Peru and Uruguay had their own wars against Spain and was declaring independence from Spain. The Monroe Doctrine, the seed was planted during the presidency of George Washington, which the intent was to keep Europe out of the West. Basically, keep Britain, keep France, keep Spain, keep Portugal out and away from the Western Hemisphere. There was a lot of tests, as I made mention to earlier. The War of 1812 was seen as a test in which the United States attempted to invade Canada. Britain, along with their indigenous allies and the Canadians, held off the invasion. We ultimately saw the burning of burning of Toronto, and then also the burning of Washington in response. That eventually became a stalemate. We also saw that in 1821, before the doctrine, Russia would take territory in North America, particularly in Alaska. It caused major territorial disputes between the United States, Great Britain, who at the time was controlling Canada, the western parts as well, and then Russia, who was controlling Alaska. So they weren't able to get that dispute settled until 1825. There would still be more tests to the doctrine, particularly with Great Britain, because as I made mention, Great Britain still had land, and but as a result, the United States would take no action. When we return to history now, I'm going to talk about further tests to the doctrine here on History Now, here on ONTV.
Lake Orion families are invited to hop on over to the Orion Center for the 2019 Bunny Bop on Saturday, April 13th, beginning at 9:30 a.m. Pose for a photo with the Easter Bunny, enjoy refreshments, create crafts, and take part in a hunt for Easter eggs filled with candy and other surprises. Children will be divided by age groups and are encouraged to bring their own basket. As for the older kids in the family, Orion Township is holding its first ever flashlight egg hunt on Thursday, April 11th at 7:45 p.m. Kids aged 9 to 15 are invited to come out to Fort Pontiac at Camp Agawam to hunt for Easter eggs in the dark. There will be plenty of photo opportunities at the 2019 Bunny Bop and Flashlight Egg Hunt. For more information, call 248-391-0304 extension 3500 or visit orionparks.com.
Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina. I want to continue talking about the Monroe Doctrine, and particularly talking about the tests to the doctrine, which was declared in 1823, but it faced tests early on. I want to talk about 1832. At 1832, Great Britain invaded or retook the Falkland Islands, also known as the Malvinas Islands, from Argentina, which further angered Argentina. In the 1980s, Britain and Argentina went to war, resulting in the Malvinas Wars, or in Britain, they call it the Falklands Wars, where Argentina would invade and take over the Falklands, and the majority of people in the Falklands, or the Malvinas, wanted to stay with Great Britain. So Britain sent an army. Argentina appealed to the United States to mediate. The United States would not do so, indirectly siding with Britain, and as a result, the British crushed the Argentine army and the navy and forced the Argentine military to essentially go back to the barracks, and democracy was restored in Argentina, and Great Britain ended up retaining the Falkland or the Malvinas Islands. And again, the U.S. took no action and allowed the British to take the Falklands in 1832. In 1850, from 1848 to 1850, Argentina was actually blockaded. Buenos Aires was actually blockaded by both the British and the French. At that time, Uruguay was fighting a civil war in 1845, in which the British, French, and the Argentines were backing opposite sides. Argentina was backing a group called the Blancos, and the British and the French were backing a group called the Colorados. The war ended up going into a stalemate, and the Uruguayan Civil War was taken care of in 1850 when the British and the French left Buenos Aires, but it caused significant distrust towards the Americans from the Argentines, because the Monroe Doctrine was intended for the United States to aid the Latin American countries in the event of a European invasion. So the U.S. once again took no action. So They didn't take any action in 1832 when the British took the Falkland Islands or the Malvinan Islands. And they also took no action in the Uruguayan Civil War / the blockade of Buenos Aires. So Argentina had a lot of suspicions of the United States during the 1830s through the 1850s. Now in 1842, Hawaii was added to the Monroe Doctrine prior to becoming a state. There was a lot of fear that the British would try to establish a colony or establish relations within Hawaii, and the United States said no, Hawaii is considered an American territory. Leave them alone. So Hawaii was added to the Monroe Doctrine. Now on December 2nd, 1845, President Polk had issued the Manifest Destiny, which at that time the United States was expanding further west. And basically, once again, was telling Europe, particularly Britain, France, Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Spain and Portugal, basically not to interfere as the U.S. moved west. And at that time, having the American-Mexican War was being fought between the United States and Mexico. There was fears that Europe was going to intervene in that war, which ultimately did not happen. There was also fears that because Mexico was trying to add California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas into the Mexican Empire. Excuse me. In 1862, the doctrine would be tested again from the French invasion of Mexico. Originally the British, and the Spanish went into Mexico intending Mexico to pay off their debts. The United States was preoccupied in a civil war between the Union and the Confederacy. So the United States was not able to intervene because they were involved in their own civil war. Now, when Napoleon III decided he wanted to invade Mexico, the British and the Spanish left, leaving the French there. And the French installed Maximilian as the puppet ruler of Mexico. The French would ultimately blockade Veracruz, along with the British and the Spanish, before the British and Spanish left. Then came the Battle of Puebla, which was the Cinco de Mayo, which the Mexicans defeated the French. Now the United States would put pressure on France, forcing France to leave Mexico. After the Civil War was done, the United States basically said to France, you're a violation of the doctrine, you are to leave Mexico. France reluctantly agreed to leave Mexico, leaving Maximilian ultimately to his death. But France decided to not intervene again in Western Hemisphere affairs. Britain still continued to test the waters. Belize was annexed by the British in 1872. And then came one of Venezuela's few disputes. Venezuela in 1895 and Britain were fighting over territory in eastern Venezuela. Britain at that time had British Guiana. They were fighting over territory which near their border. And Britain actually added territory at Venezuela's expense. This would result in the Venezuelan crisis in 1902 and 1903, where Venezuela owed debts to Europe, particularly Britain, Germany, and Italy. When Venezuela could not pay off those debts, Britain and Germany both blockaded their coast. that actually caused the United States to intervene on Venezuela's behalf, fearing that the Germans were going to try to establish territory in the Western Hemisphere. But thanks to negotiations, there was a truce. Venezuela had to pay off in longer installments. But Germany and Britain ended up not blockading the Venezuelan coast and was able to get fresh supplies into Venezuela. Then in 1898, we had the United States in the Spanish-American War, which was basically over Cuba. In 1898, the United States would invade Cuba, taking Spain out of Cuba. They would take Spain out of the Philippines and in Puerto Rico. The Philippines and Puerto Rico became American territories, while Cuba was a territory, but Cuba declared independence in 1902. That war only went 3 months. The American military overwhelmed Spain and caused the Treaty of Paris in 1898, which caused Spain to relinquish its last remnants of their colonial empire in North America, or in the Western Hemisphere. Now, when we return to history now, we're going to talk about the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century here on History Now, here on ONTV.
Hi, I have some exciting news in case you haven't heard. The Orion Chamber is hosting a Women in Business Conference. It's going to be on Tuesday, March 19th from 11 o'clock to 1 at Kings Court Castle in Canterbury Village. It's going to be beautifully decorated by something fabulous, which brings me to the speakers. They're going to have Kimberly Allen, who owns Something Fabulous, along with Susan Kruger and Carrie Birmingham, along with, and the keynote speaker is Angela Moore. She's president of The Body Principle. The cost is very inexpensive. It's less than the cost of a professional headshot. Why do I bring this up? Because they had invited me, Paula, with Paula Kurzawa Photography, to photograph all the people that attend a free headshot. So if you have not registered, you need to do that very soon. They're closing the registration quickly. And I heard the food was going to be amazing, so hopefully they'll feed me. If you want any tips on how to get the best headshot, please look at my video. It's on my website, Paula Kurzawa Photography. Thank you so much, and enjoy the conference.
Welcome back to History Now here on ONTV. I'm your host, Anthony Taormina. I want to talk about the Monroe Doctrine in the 19th and 20th centuries. It's important to talk about because the Monroe Doctrine is still talked about today in United States policy over Latin America. Now, in 1930, at this time in the 1900s, there was still some friction between the United States and Latin America over the United States being seen as either a protectorate or a bully to several countries in Latin America, particularly Mexico, Venezuela, Argentina. Those were the particular countries that had suspicions of the United States. Now, this would change in 1933 when President Roosevelt introduced a policy called the Good Neighbor Policy, where the United States, instead of dictating, decided to work with their Latin American allies. And this was very, very popular in Latin America because instead of the United States being seen as controlling and dominating over their Latin American counterparts, they would agree to work with their Latin American counterparts. And as a result, this was very popular in Latin America. This could be dictated in World War II, where the United States, where the United States in Latin America, the majority of Latin American countries allied with the United States, particularly Mexico and Brazil. But it's also similar to in World War I, where we had Germany tried to persuade Mexico to join the war and fight against the United States in return for California, Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. Germany promised them those lands from the United States. When Great Britain intercepted the Zimmerman telegram, the United States was furious, and Mexico had no intention of going to war with the United States, especially since Mexico was very much engaged in their own Mexican Revolution at that time, which was a much more internal and much more focal point struggle in Mexico. But there was that attempt to get Mexico to fight the United States, and that was not done, and as a result, Mexico declared neutrality, and the United States ultimately went to war with Germany. That was back in World War I. In World War II, it was different. There was an agreement between the United States and the Latin American countries, with the exception of Argentina, that they would support and defend the Western Hemisphere from Germany and Japan. Now, Germany would attempt to use U-boats and would also bombard the coastlines of Latin America and of the United States, particularly in Mexico and Brazil. And as a result, those countries went to war with Germany. It got to the point where when the United States and Germany went to war, Joachim von Ribbentrop ended up having his deputy foreign minister, Weizsäcker, accept the declaration of war from the Latin American countries, thinking of them to be a joke, but they were not. Mexico and Brazil gave the most support to the United States during World War II, often engaging in war. Brazil would fight in Europe. They'd send several of their troops into Italy. Mexico would also fight, helping the United States, particularly in Europe and also against Japan. Then came the Cold War. The Cold War started. The United States felt the need to defend Latin America from communism. At this point, the Soviet Union had also become a world power. There was a lot of fear about communism, that it was going to spread. But it was a very, very scary time, particularly in several countries in Latin America. So the United States felt the need, instead of their good neighbor policy, they felt the need to defend Latin America and the Western Hemisphere, for that matter, from communism. They also gave policy of the Monroe Doctrine to the OAS, which was the Organization of American States in 1948, which was a group between the United States, Canada, Mexico, and Latin America, and the Caribbean. This would be tested in 1953 following the Cuban Revolution, when Fidel Castro, Raul Castro, Che Guevara, and Cuban revolutionaries overthrew the government of Batista, who was seen as a dictator in Cuba, and ended up establishing relations with the Soviet Union and became one of the first communist countries in the Western Hemisphere. The United States attempted to prevent this from trying to overthrow the Castro regime in the Bay of Pigs invasion. That ultimately failed, and the Cuban exiles who were sent there were captured and also later executed. Some were executed. This paranoia from the United States caused a lot of other Latin American governments friendly with the United States to get really concerned. And we had this Operation Condor in 1975, where we would see the United States support or ally with military dictators in Latin America, particularly Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Paraguay, and Uruguay. They were all supported, all those militaries were supported by the U.S. with the intent of forcing pro-left, pro-communist governments out of power because of the fear. And in some cases, there was a democratically government in Guatemala, which was forcibly overthrown by the military and by the United States. So it wasn't exactly the best of relations, but in the United States, the view was if they are showing communist ties or likabilities or relationships to the communist governments, then, they're going to get forced out, especially in the Western Hemisphere, because the U.S. felt the need to defend Latin America from communism and often had these alliances with military dictators. I'm going to mention these briefly because we're going to probably go over them in other History Now shows in the future. Argentina, in particular, the Dirty War. I'm going to eventually talk about Chile under Augusto Pinochet, Brazil, and then Bolivia, as well. All of those had military juntas where they would aid and overthrow governments. They would have arrests and forced disappearances of people, and millions of people were killed just based off the suspicions of enforced disappearances, based off the suspicions of whether they were aiding communism or not. And then in 1984, we had something going on in Nicaragua, the Contras affair, which there was an attempt from the United States and allies known as the Contras to overthrow the Sandinistas, which was led by Daniel Ortega, who was then in charge of Nicaragua, actually would return to become Nicaragua's president from 2007 to the present day. So Nicaragua, in many ways, is still very much friendly to countries, particularly Cuba and Venezuela, both of those who are, quote, socialist states. Venezuela had Hugo Chavez, and then also Nicolas Maduro, who is embroiled right now in a political battle in Venezuela with pro opposition who are seen as pro United States. In 2013, something interesting happened where John Kerry, who was our Secretary of State at the time under Barack Obama, declared that the Monroe Doctrine was dead, urging the United States and Latin America to return to working together. But under today's Republican government, which is led by Donald Trump, and then also John Bolton and Mr. Pompeo declared that the Monroe Doctrine, however, was alive and well, and that the goal was to end socialist governments in Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, as recently shared about with Trump's speech in Miami about particularly Venezuela. The Monroe Doctrine is still alive and well. The question is, how is it defended? And that's a question that we'll find out in the next several years. It could go, maybe even go decades. So we'll find out. But the Monroe Doctrine was originally intended to drive Europe out of the Western Hemisphere. But now the form has changed. It was European governments at first. Now it's these other ideologies like socialism and communism. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the near future and beyond. Well, that'll do it for History Now. Have a great night, Lake Orion. See you soon, and take care. Have a good evening.